Yo, what's good, guys? Today we got what would America be like if we lost the revolution? If Britain would have beaten our asses all the way back then, what would we be like today? Would I be speaking with a British accent, eating some tea and crumpets? Let's find out, man.
Of Lexington and Concord, the opening shots of the American Revolution pitting a scrappy colonial army against the might of the British Empire. It was the culmination of years of harsh treatment from the English forces, including the massacre of peaceful protesters in Boston and the tax hikes that led to the Boston Tea Party. And the world watched as the ultimate underdogs led by George Washington turned back the forces of Great Britain and created a new country, the United States of America. But what if it didn't work out that way? 700 British soldiers had been sent to destroy colonial supplies and cut off the rebellion before it could start. Warning was given by Paul Revere and the other riders of the British arrival. But in this timeline, a stray butterfly spooked the horses of the warning team, keeping them from ever reaching their destinations. The British swept in and
You know what's crazy is he mentions like, oh, in this timeline, a butterfly scares away the horse. How fragile the world we are in today is, and like how easily things could have been so much different. Even like, as he said, a horse gets spooked, it takes off. Like, it's crazy to think of how many like small things it would just take to like change the entire world.
captured the arms caches and arrested the ringleaders planning to fight the British. Prominent founding fathers like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were interrogated by the British, likely disavowing all involvement, but one thing was sure: there would not be an American Revolution in this timeline. Under the hard-nosed approach by King George III, the potential revolution had been quelled, and he would likely take care to make sure it never repeated. British troops would maintain a strong presence in the colonies, rooting out any sign of rebellion. George was infamous as the king who had the harshest approach
Nah, leave us alone. No.
toward the
we
colonies,
refuse.
spurring increased resistance, but it's likely that after a close call, he might have been advised by those he trusts to hold off on any new taxes for a while. After all, the colonies were a valuable resource, so it's likely that the status quo would have remained in place for the next few decades.
Can we talk about this dude looks... I know, like, I've heard somewhere George Washington was, like, related to the royal family and all that. Brudda, they look exactly the same.
As long as George III remained in power, and that would be a while. George III had a reputation of being a bit of a disaster.
Also, can we point out low-key George versus George? Like, that's kind of crazy.
But he
Like,
was
weird
actually the longest
coincidences.
reigning king in British history, serving for almost 60 years.
Oh,
His
damn.
successor, George IV, was seen as a dilettante who only reigned for 10 years. Selfish and irresponsible, his reign was heavily influenced by his advisors, and as such, it's likely they just would have advised him to keep things going under his father's colonial policies for the term. After all, there were parties to attend back in London. But back in the colonies, things have changed a lot. Many of the founding fathers who defined the march to independence have since passed away, with Franklin and Washington likely not having anywhere near the influence on history they did in our timeline. However, it's likely an independence-minded movement continues in the colonies, focused less on fighting for independence than on developing the colony's culture, and they have a lot of room to do it in. While the original United States post-revolution was only composed of 13 colonies, the British territories they're part of now are much larger, including much of what's now Canada. And the crisis happening in another country might be as big a factor as what's happening in England. While the American Revolution didn't happen in this timeline, odds are another revolution did, the French Revolution. The circumstances there were primarily driven by poverty and populist rage against an out-of-touch monarch. And while it's possible that the American events helped to influence it, they also quickly spiraled out of control, and the Americans who supported it in our timeline were rather ineffectual at pushing it in their direction. And some were even imprisoned for their efforts. So
That's
odds are
crazy.
that Danton and Robespierre still rose, and the king and Marie Antoinette still wound up facing Madame Guillotine. And the reign
Like, honestly, though, I like how this man, like, puts these stories together. Like, I feel like I'm watching a TV show. Like, this is cool as hell.
of terror still sent France into chaos until it fell, leading to the rise of Emperor Napoleon. And that would give Britain the leverage it needed. France and Britain have long been bitter enemies, and in our timeline, both saw their empires decline significantly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Britain saw itself lose its colonies, while France lost much of its territory to Britain in the Seven Years' War. That gave Britain a dominant foothold in North America, including control of the French-speaking territory of Quebec. So, with France relegated to rump territory in the continent and dealing with political upheaval, odds are that Britain would have been able to take America's place in the Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s, giving the country near total dominance of North America with only Spain to oppose it. But the dominant country would be able to face a major challenge. The United States' history was largely one of expansion for most of its first 70 years, but a major crisis was brewing: slavery. The new country chose to keep the oppressive institution to appease the southern states, although it did abolish the slave trade in 1807. This just led to it creating harsher rules to keep its enslaved population in perpetual bondage. It wasn't until the 1860s, after a brutal civil war, that the United States abolished slavery, and even then it was over a century before the system of racial oppression in the South would be addressed. But in this timeline, things would be very different. You might think that under a colonial power, progress might be even slower. After all, Britain helped bring the institution of slavery to the continent of North America, along with other colonial powers. But actually, the slave trade was abolished in Great Britain the same year as it was in the United States, and pressure continued amongst abolitionist members of Parliament to eliminate the institution for good. The result was that in 1833, Great Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act.
So slavery probably would have ended sooner, because if Britain was running things, they probably would have been a lot more strict, whereas with the U.S., like, man, they just had a civil war. They really were like, slavery's over, but I don't think they were trying to push things, so maybe, would have had equal rights and all that a little sooner too then.
Act, which eliminated the possession of slaves in the country and all territories controlled by it, with the exception of those managed by the East India Company. That included the massive North America territories. So how does this play out across the pond? The abolition of slavery in the UK went relatively smoothly because Great Britain was not an agricultural-driven market. It was a relatively small island nation quickly becoming a hub of India. The United States might not have been independent at this point, but odds are its territorial breakdown is still fairly similar. You have the industrialized northern states and the more agricultural southern states, which are making much more heavy use of slaves. And as word starts to spread that the institution might be coming to an end, odds are we'd see some rebellion. And instead of a civil war, it's time for the American Revolution 2.0? Things could have been very different if the United States lost an extended revolution back in the 1770s, but in this timeline it was crushed with relatively little effort by the British. That means that the colonies would have been allowed to develop at their own pace under the oversight of the Crown, and they likely have all their own governors and local political figures. It's impossible to know if someone who is a governor or a senator in the US would still be prominent here, but there are some figures who are such major players who are so determined to make their voices heard that it's almost impossible to imagine they wouldn't emerge in any circumstance. And so enters John C. Calhoun into the fray.
But also you gotta think, right, if America wasn't America, right, it was like the United States, well, I guess it's a continent, but still, like, if the United States was, like, owned by Britain, who's to say that, all these people would have even come to be? Like, that's where, like, you get down this rabbit hole and you want to use, like, real life people, but, like, who's to say, an ancestor of this dude didn't die in the war trying to fight off the British? Like, it's a tricky rabbit hole to slide down.
Fiery South Carolina radical.
But I don't know, but I find this, like, alternate history stuff fascinating. Like, this, like, I'm not saying much because I'm just, like, I feel like I'm watching a TV show right now.
Rose to prominence in the United States as the only vice president to lead a rebellion against his own president, supporting South Carolina in a dispute with the federal government over tariffs. He would later emerge as one of the most prominent figures in the lead-up to the Civil War, refusing any concessions to abolitionists and advocating for secession if the institution of slavery was infringed upon. He would die 10 years before the Civil War began, but his fiery speech in Congress is seen by many as the turning point where conflict was inevitable. And in this timeline, the crisis over slavery happened several decades earlier. Instead of being a dying old war horse in 1850, Calhoun is a hale fire breather of 51 in 1833, when the word of the Slavery Abolition Act filters down from Parliament. Odds are he's a powerhouse in South Carolina colonial politics, perhaps even the governor, and he proved that he was anything but shy when it came to opposing the government. So odds are good that when the attempt to persuade the Crown out of passing the bill failed, he would be ready to defy them and try to create the Confederacy 30 years early. But this would be a very different conflict. The map of the country looks a little different in this timeline, with the much larger territory of Canada joining
Dude.
it.
Would we then have the biggest country in the world? Because right now, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's, what, landmass wise, isn't it Australia that's the biggest? I know that's the biggest continent, so I want to say that's the biggest country. So, well, if it's the biggest continent, then it wouldn't be I don't know, I'm confusing myself. But would this hypothetically be, like, the biggest country? Let me know in the
However,
comments.
it's unlikely that Great Britain would have been quite as involved in the southern border and looking to take territory from Spain. So it's possible that Texas would not be a part of the United States. This means the Confederacy is little more than a rump state consisting of the southern states from Virginia to Florida, against one of the biggest empires the world has ever seen. While in the U.S. Civil War, the two territories were relatively even, with the Confederacy winning key early victories and even making inroads into the North in places like Pennsylvania, the odds are this time the war goes much more quickly, because the British are coming. The early rebellion would likely be fierce and take colonists by surprise. The odds are the southern troops might be able to take some territory to defend their region, because the North would not be expecting a fight from their fellow colonies. But when word got back to the Crown about what was going on, they would be likely to respond fiercely. While the United Kingdom stayed neutral in the Civil War and even considered giving aid to the Confederacy to weaken their old enemies, this time the whole force...
First off, I didn't know that. I never knew that, I never knew that the UK thought of siding with the Confederates. I did know that, like, they brought in the whole slavery thing to prevent... My knowledge was that they brought in slavery to prevent them from doing that. But I didn't know that that was actually something they were about to do.
So the British Empire would be bearing down on the rebels, and the man in charge would have a big role in it. George IV passed away in 1830 and left no heirs, so his successor was William IV, his younger brother, and one of the oldest monarchs to ever take the throne at 65. But while he only reigned for 7 years due to his age, he was one of the most consequential kings of the era. A reformer and a strong leader, he approved of the abolition of slavery and also restricted child labor and improved the welfare system. However, he believed in keeping the British Empire strong and would not take well to a rebellion. And the Second American Revolution would go down just like the first. The early successes of the Southern Rebellion would be short-lived, as reinforcements streamed over from Great Britain and delivered arms and soldiers. Any colonial resistance would be met with far superior forces, and the odds are that the Southern slaveholders would suffer heavy losses early on. William IV would perhaps offer them a chance to surrender, a wise move, but Calhoun, as the ringleader of the rebellion, would be unlikely to take the olive branch, so his army would go down in flames, and the British Crown would be unlikely to deal as kindly with him as the United States did with Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, bringing an end to the institution of slavery in the American colonies. And from there, things might work out surprisingly well. The path to abolishing slavery in our timeline was bumpy, with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln kneecapping efforts to enforce racial equality and a compromise over a possibly stolen election a decade later, leading to the end of most Reconstruction efforts. This would lead to a century of racial oppression and segregation in the South. But in this timeline, the British would be responsible for overseeing the aftermath, and they would likely keep tighter control of the southern colonies. The aid of the northern colonies in the war effort would mean
Just
the colonies
tell those Southerners if they don't behave, there'll be no biscuits with their tea. That's tough. Come on now.
the whole wouldn't be punished, but the rebellious territories would
I
likely
like
see
this
a
guy's little, text things. He's got some funny little jokes in there.
heavier British presence for a long time, and any local officials who aided in the rebellion would likely see themselves forced out of power permanently. But a lot of this would have to do with a new figure. The elderly William IV would be dead by 1837, and he would be replaced by not another king, but by his niece Victoria, in the latest complex succession. Victoria took office at only 18 years old, and her reign was one of the most consequential in British history. She was known as a strong supporter of British expansionism and would reign for 63 years, the longest
that's
term
a
of
long
service in the
time.
history of the British Crown until the modern day. So, the fate of the colonies would to a large extent be determined by the whims of this woman. Well, sort of. Britain has been a constitutional monarchy since 1688, and additional restrictions on the monarch's power were put into place since. This meant that Parliament has much of an impact on the laws of the time as Queen Victoria, and some monarchs were much more powerful than others. Victoria would inherit a British Empire at its peak, as well as an unsettled status quo in the North American colonies. But the leadership of these colonies in helping to put down the rebellion of the southern states would be in good standing with the British government, and the region would be seen as the crown jewel of the territories. And that means one major question would be brewing. We all know how the United States gained independence in our timeline, but what about Canada? It was a much more sedate affair, with the British territories holding conferences to ask for independence and negotiating an exit from the United Kingdom. There was no revolution, and in many ways the British were ready to let it go. They wanted the country to defend itself, to take the financial burden off of them, and many English-Canadian nationalists wanted to unify the territories and consolidate.
Facts, bro. Man, it's cold as hell where I live. I can't imagine being farther up north, man. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, let them deal with themselves.
Their control over French-speaking Quebec. But with no significant tension with the parent country, there was no desire for a hard break. So when Canada became independent, they chose to remain a Commonwealth country and maintain the Queen as their head of state while becoming autonomous in all government affairs. Would the same have happened to the United Territories in this alternate timeline? It is possible, but there are a few things in the way. For one, the United States is much more fertile territory and had many more resources than Canada. Almost doubling the territory gives Britain almost an entire continent to control, but it also means higher cost to administer the territory. The odds are that Victoria and Parliament would be open to these negotiations for independence, but they might drive a harder bargain, wanting preferable trade deals long-term with the new country to ensure access to its resources. Whatever the terms of the deal, odds are they would be preferable to what had been imposed on them by the British Crown as a colony. And so this new country is born into a whole different world. In an instant, the United States of North America was born and became the largest country in the world by sheer space.
Okay, it is. Okay, that's what I was trying to figure out earlier, but I confused myself. Okay, we right.
Containing all the territory of Canada and much of the modern-day United States, it would have the benefits of decades of buildup from the British Empire.
Also, here's the question. Do you guys think that, say, like, if the UK was so set on expanding, why wouldn't they have tried to take over Mexico, too?
As well as the scars of a recent rebellion. But in this time of growth, it's not the only country in North America to benefit. With the American Revolution never happening...
Nah, listen, I promise that wasn't planned. I promise you that wasn't planned. Nah, that seems so sus. I was just looking at Mexico. I was like, wait, what about Mexico? What would happen there? Like, I was like, I feel like they'd take over Mexico. Like, I don't know.
Spain likely had the Southwest mostly to...
taking over places. You know, y'all kind of like to do that a little bit. So that's what I'm thinking. Like, I feel like they would have.
Without the boost of the American Revolution to the hopes of the colonized countries worldwide, would Mexico have successfully won its own war in 1821? The Magic 8 Ball says, outlook cloudy. So it's possible that the Southwest North America would still be dominated by the Spanish crown, holding not just Mexico but most of what's the American Southwest today. So is another war brewing? Probably not. While the territories of North America did eventually gain independence, they're all far from abandoned by Great Britain.
That's crazy too, because Alaska would be Russia. That's crazy too.
Instead, they're likely considered extended family, and if someone punches your cousin, odds are you're jumping into the fray.
So we'd be like how we are with Canada today. Okay.
Spain would be very cautious about trying to take any territory from this new country and vice versa. While it's possible the two empires could go to war again, maybe provoked by similar events to the Spanish-American War, that would be a much larger conflict and not likely to erupt immediately. So it's possible that Texas and California might never be united with the rest of the territory, but the new country is also very much not in need of extra territory. But this would change a lot of things going forward, including for many of the area's most oppressed people. What would happen to the Native Americans in this new status quo? It wouldn't be all sunshine and roses, since the British, like all colonial powers, were responsible for mass displacement and murder. But certain key atrocities might have been averted. There was never a President Andrew Jackson in this timeline, so there was never a trail of tears. Much of the United States' worst atrocities toward natives happened in the Rush West, which would have happened in a much more orderly method in this timeline. However, the US and Canada shared certain atrocities, such as the residential schools where native children were taken from their parents and forcibly educated to behave more like white people. Those would still exist here under...
That's crazy. See, man, like, I need to, like, you know, look more into the history of shit, right? Like, that's crazy. I didn't know that. Damn.
The British and the new government, but there's hope for a better future. Today, Canada's programs of reparations and autonomy for natives go further than the US, and that might carry over in the Union. But what about the victims of slavery? Well, for one thing, slavery ends 30 years earlier. That's generations of people who aren't born into bondage. The worst of segregation never happens as well, but for the millions of people who become free when slavery ends, things would likely turn out very differently. The British control huge swaths of territory in Africa and the Caribbean, and the odds are they might offer some former slaves, especially those taken near the end of the slave trade, the choice to stay in the territory or return to their homeland. It's impossible to know how many would take the offer, but odds are most would not want to be displaced if they had built a life here. So today's country might be an equally diverse place, but one without the century of racial tension that culminated in the growing pains of the civil rights movement. And in some ways, history bends toward the same end. The territory did eventually gain independence, but with much less bloodshed. And most of European history proceeded apace, including eventually the World Wars. The growing tension between Germany and the rest of Europe would still have happened, but with one big difference: the closer ties between the nation taking up most of North America and its former colonial power. In our timeline, Britain was largely left alone to fight the German-aligned forces sweeping across Europe for the first part of both wars, and it took major provocations to get the United States involved. A dirty German-Mexican deal the first time, and Pearl Harbor the second. But this time, as a Commonwealth nation, we likely would have been eager to get involved and help Great Britain. Canada entered both wars long before the United States, and the added...
So I wonder too, right? Like, so especially in like World War I and II, we were kind of like the big dogs. We were like the powerhouses, right? We came in there and fucked them up. So like, I wonder if that would have been Britain, right? Because they would have had more knowledge on what we were doing. So I wonder if Britain would have been like the top of the shit instead of us.
Forces might have helped win World War I and potentially ended Hitler's reign several years before the Allies were able to in our timeline.
It's crazy how in so many weird ways in his hypothetical, the world almost seems like it would have been better. Like, that's crazy. Like, it's just one little, small change could have completely changed the whole layout we're at today.
Which then raises the question, would it have been better if the United States didn't...
Nah, what the fuck? No, I say that and then the video says it after. What the bruh, stop spying on me. I'm like predicting shit.
...and its independence by revolution. It's unlikely that Britain would have kept the colonies forever, and even far-flung colonies like Australia gained their independence peacefully eventually. Part of this was the natural decline of the British Empire, but many countries were able to negotiate for an exit and the benefits of Commonwealth status without conflict. Some countries weren't so lucky in the modern era, including Kenya, which fought a difficult battle for independence in the 20th century. But a country largely seen as an extension of Britain would have had an easier go. So what would the country look like now? Well, for one thing, it would be the largest country in the world. Combining Canada and the United States makes it larger than Russia. And while there's no guarantee that it would have all the territories...
Russia, that's the largest country. I said Russia, but then I doubted myself. See, I said Russia, and I was like, wait, is it Australia? I doubted myself, because Australia is the biggest continent.
Southwest by now,
and then it's like Australia is kind of a whole country, which is why I'm like,
to have expanded somewhat. Both the United States...
I say kinda, like it is.
...and Great Britain are strong economies, so this new country would have had the same strong infrastructure to build off. Of course, not everything would be sunshine and roses. All of the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States still have problems with the treatment of non-white residents in their countries, and any colonial power will be dealing with its past sins for a long time. But it would likely stand alone as the world's greatest power. The United States is arguably the...
So we still would have had, like, one of the stronger militaries then.
...world's only superpower today, but the odds are good that Great Britain would have had much more power and influence than it does in our timeline. An early victory in World War II, thanks to North America entering earlier, would have given Britain a stronger hand in negotiations post-war, and it would have kept many of its colonial holdings, while the anti-colonial movement would have continued and they likely would have given many of them independence. It might have been a smoother process. After all, their biggest colony wound up gaining independence peacefully. The only thing we know for sure, if the American Revolution didn't happen, there likely would have been a lot more tea and tears in North America when the Queen passed away. Want to know about some other historical hypotheticals? Check.
I mean, this was... What if Columbus never... that's another good one. What if Columbus never discovered America? That'd be cool too. Hey, let me know. What would you guys like me to watch? Without further ado, like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell. You know how YouTube works. And man, I feel like I just watched a little movie. I'm about to go get me some popcorn or something and just chill out. I don't know. Bye. With